Once upon a time in a tranquil neighborhood, I found myself at odds with the local homeowners association, HOA. For weeks, they had been cutting across my beautifully manicured lawn, leaving unsightly tracks and ruining my hard work. The culprit? A particularly zealous member of the HOA, whom I affectionately dubbed Karen. She seemed to take pleasure in enforcing the rules, often disregarding my efforts to maintain my property. After yet another instance of her trampling through my garden, I decided it was time for some creative revenge. I spent hours brainstorming how to send a message that would make Karen think twice before crossing my lawn again. My idea was simple yet effective. I would install a whimsical garden gnome right at the edge of my property, but not just any gnome. This one would be decked out in a bright pink tutu, oversized sunglasses, and a cheeky grin. To top it off, I added a sign that read, "Keep off my grass, Karen's tutu zone." The day I unveiled my masterpiece was one of triumph. As I watched from my window, I could see Karen approaching, her eyes widening in disbelief as she took in my creation. The gnome stood proudly, a beacon of humor and defiance against her relentless rule enforcement. Word spread quickly through the neighborhood. My neighbors found it hilarious and began to stop by to take pictures with the gnome. Even Karen couldn't help but chuckle as she reluctantly admitted that the gnome was kind of funny. From that day on, the HOA stopped cutting across my lawn. Karen, now cautious, gave my yard a wide berth. And as for the gnome, he became a beloved fixture, a symbol of creativity and a reminder that sometimes humor is the best way to handle difficult situations. In the end, I learned that standing up for myself didn't have to be confrontational. It just required a little imagination. And Karen, she would never forget the day she met the gnome in the tutu. My name's Ethan, and I live in a quiet suburban neighborhood, or at least it used to be quiet before the HOA decided my yard was their shortcut. I bought my home 5 years ago. It sat on the corner of a cul-de-sac, with a big green front lawn and a small walking path that wrapped behind my property. I was proud of that lawn. It was my weekend therapy. But the HOA board, especially a woman named Karen Mitchell, had other ideas. The problem begins one afternoon. I noticed a couple of HOA members walking right across my lawn, not the sidewalk, not the street. They were literally trampling over my grass like it was a public park. When I confronted them, Karen rolled her eyes. "Ethan, it's just grass. We have to check the back fence line for maintenance." "Don't be so dramatic." I reminded her that the property line was clearly marked and my lawn wasn't part of HOA common grounds. She smirked. "We make the rules here. That line burned into my brain." Weeks of disrespect. For the next month, they kept cutting across. HOA landscapers used my lawn as a shortcut to get to the park behind my house. Their boots left ruts. They left trash. Even one of their leaf blowers scratched my fence. Every complaint I sent was ignored. Emails? Unanswered. Pictures? Not enough evidence. Karen started getting smug. At the next HOA meeting, she actually joked, "Maybe Ethan should donate his lawn to the community. He doesn't even use it." The room laughed. That's when I decided I'd had enough. I did some research and found my property deed online. Sure enough, the fence line, the lawn, everything up to the sidewalk was 100% private property. Then, I made 2 small investments: a private property, no trespassing sign on both sides of my lawn. Motion-activated sprinklers, the kind you can program to detect motion anytime, and I didn't stop there. I installed a small camera hidden in a garden gnome, the surprise. The following Monday, I sat on my porch pretending to read a newspaper. At 9:14 a.m. sharp, Karen and 2 landscapers walked up again, stepping right past the new signs. Karen said something like, "Oh, Ethan put up toys now? Cute." She took one more step, and whoosh! The sprinklers erupted, blasting all 3 of them from both sides. They shrieked like cats. Papers flew everywhere. Karen slipped and fell backward into the mud. I swear it was the most satisfying thing I've ever seen. The landscapers ran off, but Karen stomped toward my porch, dripping wet, screaming, "You can't do this to HOA board members. We'll fine you." I calmly pointed to the sign. "Karen, you just trespassed on private property. I have you on video. Maybe you'll be the one fined." The fallout, she tried to file a complaint with the HOA. But guess what? My lawyer sent them the deed, the photos, and a cease and desist notice within 24 hours. 2 weeks later, the HOA attorney contacted me with an apology. Karen was removed from her position on the maintenance committee, and the HOA had to pay for my lawn repair. Now every time I mow, the same neighbors who once laughed at me give a thumbs up. Karen still lives 3 houses down, but she walks the long way around the street now. Moral of the story, if an HOA or anyone tries to walk all over you or your lawn, remember, boundaries matter. And sometimes, a well-timed sprinkler speaks louder than a lawyer. The first time it happened, I thought it was just the mail carrier being lazy. A faint diagonal line of bent grass across the pristine green of my front lawn. The second time, I was working in the garage and saw her, Patty. Patty wasn't just a neighbor. She was the neighbor, the self-appointed queen of the Willow Creek Homeowners Association, HOA Aesthetics Committee, a woman who treated my property as a personal extension of her regulatory domain. She was cutting the corner of my yard, striding from her driveway to her friend's house across the street, saving herself exactly 7 seconds of sidewalk time. Her route went directly over the corner of my freshly edged, perfectly green lawn. When I politely asked her to use the sidewalk, her response was classic Willow Creek aristocracy. "It's faster, dear. And really, it's just grass. It will bounce back." But it didn't bounce back. Day after day, she, and eventually a few others following her lead, wore down a distinct muddy track across my corner lot. The path was an eyesore, a testament to entitlement, and a direct violation of the unwritten rule of neighborly respect. I put up a small decorative fence. Patty walked around it. I added a "Please use sidewalk" sign. Patty complained to the HOA that the sign was unapproved yard signage. I knew my fence would just draw a fine and a single flower pot would be moved. I needed a solution that was invisible from a distance, permanent, compliant with the HOA's vague natural landscaping rules, and, most importantly, utterly disruptive to her routine. I needed a surprise that Patty would truly never forget. The installation, I spent a Saturday afternoon at the garden supply store. My plan was not to block the path, but to make the path fundamentally unappealing. My lawn's corner was about 8 feet square. In the exact path of the shortcut, I carefully dug out 3 small, shallow holes. Into these holes, I planted what looked, from a distance, like low-lying, green ground cover. They were 3 varieties of creeping, sprawling cacti. Specifically, cholla cactus, jumping cactus, known for its incredibly barbed segments that detach with the slightest brush. Prickly pear, cactus, low-lying variety, with needles large enough to be seen, but small enough to be easily missed. Hedgehog cactus, a densely spined, low-growing specimen. I ensured they were planted just high enough to be stepped on by a careless pedestrian, but low enough that they were legally considered a ground cover and not a bush or unapproved structure. They were green, they were natural, and they were deadly. I then filled in around them with a loose layer of fresh mulch, blending the area back into the surrounding grass. From the sidewalk, the corner of the lawn looked perfectly safe. Just a transition from grass to mulch, with some new, low-lying greenery. The payoff, the following Monday, I watched from my upstairs window, my coffee cup ready. Patty, clad in her favorite athleisure wear and clutching a bottle of expensive water, approached the corner. She didn't pause. She didn't look down. She put her right foot squarely onto the newly mulched area. The sound wasn't a scream at first. It was a sudden, involuntary, sharp hiss of pure shock, followed by a frantic, unbalanced hop. The cholla had done its job. The microscopic barbs immediately latched onto the mesh fabric of her expensive designer shoe. She hopped on one foot, losing her water bottle, which rolled onto the street. When she tried to shake the other foot free, the prickly pear, hidden beneath a light scattering of mulch, made contact with her ankle. The final, theatrical act was Patty collapsing in a heap on the ground, frantically swatting at her lower leg. The spines were everywhere, in her shoe, on her ankle, and in the palm of her hand where she'd instinctively tried to catch herself. She was not visibly bleeding, but the sight of her sitting in the dirt, trapped by a tiny patch of ground cover, was priceless. The aftermath, Patty had to call her husband to help her, who, after a tense 5 minutes, gingerly carried her back across the street, using the sidewalk. I noted. I received an immediate, furious letter from the HOA the next day, stating that my new landscaping presented a safety hazard and demanding immediate removal. I wrote back, citing the section of the bylaws concerning natural ground cover and attaching photos of my perfectly healthy, low-profile cacti. I pointed out that the hazard was only created by trespassing on private property and suggested that all HOA members be reminded to use the designated public sidewalks to avoid further incidents with the natural flora. The matter was dropped. Patty Neve. Patty Neve.